He laughed when his father mocked my dead mom. That's when I knew I couldn't marry him. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just froze. My fingers still curled around the base of a champagne glass, but I couldn't feel it anymore. My chest tightened like someone had pulled a cord through my ribs and yanked. His father stood before a room full of guests, raising his glass, smiling. Clara Jensen, he said, always had something to say, didn't she? Always managed to insert herself whether we asked or not. Laughter followed, including Elliot's. That's when everything inside me cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but like a bone giving way beneath too much weight. I didn't walk out that moment, not yet. I sat there lightheaded, watching the man I loved laugh with people who turned my mother's memory into a punchline. And that's how it began, the unraveling. If you were in my place, would you still go through with the wedding? Have you ever sat in a room full of smiling people and felt completely alone? Tell me in the comments, and if you've ever had to choose between peace and performance, don't forget to subscribe. To understand why I stood up that night in the middle of a perfectly decorated rehearsal dinner and walked away from the life I was supposed to have, you need to know where I come from. My name is Clara Jensen. I'm 33 years old, a freelance photographer based in Boston. I was raised in Dorchester in a cramped third-floor walk-up above a laundromat by my mother, Marilyn. She was the kind of woman who made survival look graceful. She worked 3 jobs, waitress, cleaner, and sometimes a nighttime hotel clerk, just to keep food on the table and books in my backpack. We didn't have a backyard or matching plates, but we had love, the kind that made everything else feel enough. She used to hum old Nat King Cole songs while folding laundry. She taught me how to braid my own hair, how to stitch the holes in my jeans, and how to walk into a room like I belonged, even when no one else thought I did. She also taught me that affection without respect wasn't love. Don't confuse being seen with being cherished, she'd say. But I did. At least for a while. I met Elliot Hargrave at a charity art auction in Beacon Hill. He was tall, confident, dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than a month of my rent. He wasn't the kind of person I expected to notice me, yet he did. He paused in front of one of my photographs, a black and white portrait of an elderly man standing in front of a chain-link fence, and said, "This feels like something my mother would hang in her summer home. Timeless." I should have rolled my eyes. Instead, I laughed. That laugh in that moment was my first mistake. We went for coffee the following week, then drinks, then long weekends in Vermont. He was always so present. Not intense, just consistent. He remembered what kind of tea I liked. He bought me books I'd casually mentioned. He listened when I spoke about my mom, at least it seemed like he did. I told my mother about him a month into dating. I still remember her expression, soft around the eyes, but careful. "Sounds like he's got a good heart," she said. "Let's just hope he's got the strength to match it." At the time I thought she meant emotional resilience. Now I know she meant something deeper, integrity. The first time Elliot met her, he brought flowers. We sat on the tiny balcony with takeout Thai and a pitcher of sweet iced tea. He used his napkin the whole time. My mom asked about his work, his family, the last book he read. He answered smoothly, like he'd been rehearsing. After he left, she said, "He's impressive. I just hope he sees the world the way you do." I shrugged. "He's just formal. He's not used to us." She didn't say anything else, just nodded and cleared the table. Eventually, Elliot and I moved in together. I picked up steady freelance work, editorials, weddings, the occasional gallery feature. He got promoted at his firm. Things were stable. I started to believe this might be the kind of life I'd always hoped for: safe, beautiful, normal. Then my mom got sick. At first, it was just fatigue. Then a persistent cough. Then scans. Then the diagnosis. Stage 4. I remember sitting in the hospital bathroom, pressing my forehead against the cool tile and whispering, "No, no, no," like that would rewind time. But nothing did. Elliot came with me sometimes. He drove me to appointments, brought takeout, sat in the corner scrolling his phone while I massaged lotion into my mother's arms. He never said anything cruel, never told me to get over it, but he also never leaned in, never cried with me, never once asked, "How can I carry this with you?" When she passed, he held me that night, and I thought that was enough. But even then, something inside me began to drift, like I was standing on one side of a river and he was on the other. Both of us looking at the same sky, but from different shores. A year after her death, Elliot proposed. He took me to the rooftop of a luxury hotel with the city lights sparkling below and a string quartet playing somewhere in the background. He pulled out a ring that glittered under the stars. "Clara Jensen," he said, "make me the happiest man alive." I said yes. I smiled. I cried. But somewhere deep inside, something ached. I told myself it was grief, nerves, a natural fear of big change. I told myself this was what happiness was supposed to feel like when you'd gone through loss. Bittersweet. We started planning the wedding 2 months later. That's when the shift became unmistakable. Every time I tried to include my mother, just a photo on the memory table, a single white lily tucked into my bouquet, one line in my vows, Elliot would hesitate. She wouldn't want the day to be sad, he'd say. Let's not lean too hard into memorial territory. I started biting my tongue so much I could taste copper. At first it was little things, subtle, easy to dismiss. Then came Constance, his mother. Marilyn had such a presence, she said with a practiced smile during a planning meeting. But let's keep things modern, light. We don't want people crying through the ceremony. Then Edmund. Juliana. Clara, you've got such a big heart. Don't let it take over the wedding. Remember, this is a celebration. That was the moment I first considered that maybe I wasn't building a life with Elliot. Maybe I was being fitted into his. But I stayed. I kept planning, kept trying to honor my mother in small, quiet ways. I didn't realize yet that grief doesn't stay quiet when it's disrespected. And love without respect isn't love at all. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing about losing yourself. It's rarely dramatic. It's subtle. 1,000 tiny moments where you choose silence over discomfort, where you say it's fine instead of that hurt. Until one day you look around and realize you don't recognize your own reflection. The wedding planning with Elliot and his family felt less like a partnership and more like a presentation. Everything had to be curated, polished, tasteful. Timeless Constance would say, flipping through mood boards, filled with muted florals and antique gold accents. But when I suggested just one bloom, one soft white lily, my mother's favorite, she gave me a tight smile. Calla lilies feel a bit somber, don't they? Let's lean into roses. They're classic. I nodded even though something inside me curled. Another time I brought up including a photo of my mom at the memory table. Nothing big, just a simple frame tucked in among the candles. Elliot barely looked up from his laptop. I think my parents feel like we're already going a little heavy. Maybe let's focus on us. Focus on us. Like the woman who raised me from nothing didn't matter in this us. I started to notice how easily I got erased. I suggested a line in my vows, just a sentence about how my mother's strength taught me how to love. Elliot didn't even pause before saying, vows should be about us moving forward, not looking back. I stared at him. It's one line, he sighed. I just think we don't need to make it melancholic. My grief to him was melancholic. My mother's memory was inconvenient. Still, I didn't argue. I stopped bringing it up. I told myself I'd find quiet ways to honor her, that not everything had to be visible. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was shrinking. The rehearsal dinner guest list was another blow. 50 guests. 40 of them were from his side family business partners, clients from his father's firm, country club friends. I asked if we could add 2 of my mom's closest friends, women who'd practically helped raise me. Elliot's mother responded with a polite smile. The room has limited capacity, dear, but we'll light a candle for her. Symbolic, isn't it symbolic? The word felt like a dismissal wrapped in lace. And Elliot, he just rubbed my back and said, it's not worth fighting over. They mean well. That phrase became his go-to. They mean well. As if good intentions could excuse casual cruelty. At one tasting event, Edmund swirled his wine, looked at me and said, you're lucky Elliot is so patient. Most men would be overwhelmed by how emotionally attached you still are to your mother. I blinked. She died 2 years ago, I said. He smiled like it was a joke. Yes. Lovely woman, I'm sure. But this is a new chapter, Clara. Don't live in the past. I looked at Elliot. He kept his eyes on the road. Later in the car, I asked, why didn't you say anything? He kept driving. I didn't want to start something in front of the caterers. He said I was too attached. Like it's a flaw. Elliot shrugged. I think he was just trying to say, you deserve to move on. And that was the moment I knew he didn't understand me at all. He never had. But the moment that broke me, It wasn't even about flowers or speeches or seating charts. It was a Wednesday. We were at the Hargrave home. Constance had 3 binders open, color-coded for music decor and linens. I suggested soft cream and lavender for the centerpieces, the colors my mom wore in her final portrait. Constance didn't even flinch. Marilyn had interesting taste, but this is a modern wedding. Let's not make it look like a memorial service. Her words hit like a slap made of silk. Elliot sat right there. He heard it. He didn't blink. Just reached for a mini eclair and changed the subject. I went home that night, stood in my kitchen for almost an hour staring at the fridge. Not moving, not thinking, just waiting for the ache to settle. And when it did, something colder took its place. I wasn't just grieving my mother anymore. I was grieving myself. The version of me that still believed I could be loved without conditions. The version that thought I could fit into this family without folding in half. Even the small things became sharp. Constance continued to pronounce my last name wrong, even after I corrected her 6 times. Edmund once referred to my photography work as your little hustle. They never asked about my clients, never complimented my portfolio, never once said, "Tell us more about your mom." But they expected me to smile, to be grateful, to keep the peace. And Elliot, he expected it too. They're just being themselves, he'd say. Don't take it personally. Just focus on us. But how could I? How do you focus on us when the people who shaped him looked at me and saw nothing? How do you stay in love with someone who lets you get chipped away piece by piece until you're a version of yourself even your mother wouldn't recognize? I still smiled for photos, still showed up to dress fittings, still sent thank you notes. But inside, something had gone quiet. Not empty, just waiting. Waiting for the moment I'd finally stop apologizing for wanting to be seen. Waiting for the moment I'd remember who raised me and what she taught me. That silence isn't peace. And that dignity matters more than any wedding. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Elms, a venue Elliot's parents had spoken about for weeks. Understated elegance, Constance called it. Gold leaf menus, crystal glassware, a private pianist flown in from Connecticut. Every detail meticulously crafted, not for love, not for intimacy, but for optics. I wore the pale lavender dress my mom had once complimented during a window shopping trip. I dabbed on her favorite perfume. Not too much, just enough to feel her close. I told myself that night, just get through it. Just smile, thank the guests, survive. The dining room was filled with faces I barely knew. Most were from Elliot's side, relatives, clients, golf buddies, society friends who called me unique with forced smiles. My side, my dad, my cousin Melissa, 2 of my mother's dearest friends, Carol and Ruth. That was it. 47 guests, 5 of them mine. The room buzzed with shallow conversation, clinking forks, the sound of soft piano drifting between candle flames. I nodded, I smiled. I tasted nothing. Then the toast began. Constance was first. She stood with grace only decades of hosting luncheons could perfect. Thank you all for being here, she beamed. It means the world to us to celebrate Nathan Pardon, Elliot, and Clara, our beautiful couple. She glanced at me, glass in hand. I'll admit, when Elliot first brought Clara home, I wasn't quite sure what to think. She was artistic, independent, very expressive. A few polite chuckles followed, but I've come to appreciate her free spirit. She brings color into Elliot's structured life, and a great deal of patience. Laughter again. I felt it land. Not like a slap, like a scratch. Barely visible, but real. I looked at Elliot. He smiled, polished, comfortable. Then Edmund stood. I'd like to say a few things as well, he announced, tapping his whiskey glass. I've watched my son grow into a man who makes strong, thoughtful decisions. Choosing Clara bold. The room laughed. But tonight is about family, he said, about merging 2 lives, 2 backgrounds. He turned toward me. Now Clara comes from a spirited background. Her mother, Clara Jensen. Well, she was certainly one of a kind. Always had a suggestion, always involved, even when it wasn't asked for. A few guests chuckled. I didn't. Constance chimed in from her seat. Oh, she definitely had opinions. Edmund added, generous though. Helped us out a lot. Sometimes too much, if I'm being honest. He winked. Laughter. I froze. They were talking about her. The woman who co-signed the loan that kept their restaurant afloat. The woman who helped organize their finances when they were on the brink of bankruptcy. The woman who bought them a new oven when the old one caught fire. The woman who paid Elliot's older brother's final semester of college tuition when no one else could. And now they were turning her into a joke. My hand trembled as I reached for my water glass. Then Edmund added the final line, "She did a lot. But let's hope Clara doesn't inherit her enthusiasm. Wouldn't want her meddling too much now, would we?" More laughter. And then Elliot laughed too. Not a belly laugh. Not cruel, just a soft, breathy chuckle. The kind you let out when you want to stay in the room. The kind you let out when you choose comfort over courage. And that's when I knew. I stood up. The scrape of my chair against the floor echoed across the room. Cutlery paused midair. Conversations halted. Even the pianist froze. "Is everything all right, dear Constance?" asked, lips tight. Elliot touched my wrist. "Jules?" I stepped forward. My voice was quiet but clear. "Are you serious right now?" Edmund blinked. "Excuse me." "You stood here," I said, my voice trembling but sharp, "in front of your friends and your staff and your family, and you mocked the woman who made this wedding possible, who helped your family when no one else did. And you think that's funny?" Constance let out a nervous laugh. "Oh, come now, it was just a little humor." "No," I said louder now. "It was disrespect." I turned to Elliot. "And you laughed." His face drained. "Clara, I didn't mean you didn't mean to embarrass me, or you didn't mean to make me see exactly who you are." Silence. So loud I could hear the flicker of the candles. Carol was already wiping tears. Melissa's jaw clenched. "My father!" His fists were tight on the tablecloth, unmoving. I looked at the Hargraves. "I loved your son. I was ready to be a part of this family. But if this is how you treat the dead, I can't imagine how you treat the living." Then I turned to Elliot. My voice cracked. "We're done." And I walked out. The room didn't chase me. The music didn't start back up. I stepped into the cold night air, and for the first time in months, I could breathe. I didn't feel broken. I didn't feel humiliated. I felt alive. Something inside me had snapped free, not in anger, but in clarity. This wasn't just about my mother anymore. This was about me, and I wasn't finished. I was just getting started. The cold night air slapped my skin, but I didn't flinch. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt steady, present. I stood just outside the elms, my lavender dress clinging to me in the breeze, my breath fogging up with every exhale. Behind me, the sounds of cutlery resumed. A laugh here, a clink there. The show had continued without me. I stared at the cobblestones beneath my heels. I wasn't crying. I wasn't shaking. But something inside me said, this isn't done. My dad stepped out first. He didn't say anything, just placed a hand on my back, protective, not pressing. Melissa followed. Then Carol, then Ruth. They didn't ask if I was okay. They already knew the answer. "I need to go back in," I said. My cousin's eyes widened. "Clara, no. You don't owe them a thing," I know I replied. "But I owe myself this." My dad nodded. "We'll be right here." "No," I said. "This is something I have to do alone." I turned, walked back up the steps. My heels felt firmer now, like they had weight purpose. The double doors opened with a soft whoosh. The warmth inside hit my face like a wave of perfume and performance. Conversations slowed. Faces turned. The pianist faltered again. I walked steady until I was in the center of the room, directly across from Elliot, who sat flanked by his parents, like a defendant between lawyers. He stood too quickly. "Clara, please, let's talk outside." I shook my head. Then I raised my voice just enough for the room to hush. "I know this isn't the kind of moment anyone expected," I began. "But I have something I need to say. And I'd rather say it while everyone's still pretending they didn't hear what they just heard." A fork clattered somewhere in the back. Constance stiffened in her seat. Edmund leaned back like a man settling into a chess match he thought he'd already won. I turned to Elliot. "This wedding is off." Gasps, audible, sharp. I know it sounds sudden, but it's not. This has been building quietly, slowly, every time someone here laughed at my grief, every time you all smiled while I swallowed another insult. I turned to Edmund. "You made a joke out of the woman who helped your family, who paid for things you never repaid, who treated your son like her own. You called her meddlesome, inserted, too much." I looked at Constance. "You called her opinions heavy, her presence inconvenient. You smiled when you said it. But it wasn't kindness, it was control. And then I looked at Elliot. And you. You didn't say those things, but you let them. You let them minimize my mother. You let them reduce her legacy to a punchline. He opened his mouth. Clara, I didn't mean to. I know I interrupted. That's the problem. You didn't mean to hurt me, but you didn't mean to protect me either. Silence stretched. You were going to let me marry into this, I continued. Bind myself to people who treat pain like inconvenience, who treat memory like clutter, who treat love like negotiation. I looked around the room. I'm not walking into a marriage where I have to erase the woman who raised me. I won't marry into a family that asked me to tone down my story just so they could be comfortable in theirs. I spotted someone crying near the back. I didn't know who, didn't need to. This isn't drama. This is dignity, I said. For myself. For my mother. For the version of me that almost said I do, out of fear instead of love. I turned back to Elliot. I loved you, but I love her more. I love me more. Then I stepped away. This time I didn't hurry. No one followed. And I didn't look back. Outside the air was colder than before, but it didn't sting. My dad was waiting. He wrapped his coat around my shoulders. Melissa took my hand. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen. Carol whispered. She'd be so proud. And in that moment I felt my mother beside me. Not in some grand ghostly way, but in a breath. A memory. A steadiness I hadn't felt in a long time. I hadn't just ended a wedding. I had reclaimed something sacred. The next morning I woke before sunrise. No alarms, no noise, just silence and the hum of grief shifting into something sharper. My phone was vibrating face down on the nightstand. Texts, missed calls, voicemails. Elliot, the wedding planner, a few guests, a distant aunt from his side. I didn't check a single one. Instead, I made tea. The way my mom liked it, chamomile honey, just a dash of lemon. I sat at the kitchen counter, cupping the warmth, letting it touch the spaces where rage had burned clean through. And for a while, I just existed. Breathing. Then I walked into my room and opened the box. The small wooden keepsake box had sat on my dresser since the week after my mother's funeral. Inside were her Sunday earrings, an old church bulletin, a faded photo of us standing outside the laundromat, and the locket. Or it should have been there. I blinked, searched again, lifted each item slowly, carefully. My heart picked up its pace. The locket was gone. At first I thought maybe it had slipped into the lining. I checked every drawer, every coat pocket. I tore apart the small bedroom, growing more frantic by the second. It was gone. Only one person had been inside my apartment in the past week besides me, Elliot. He'd stopped by 2 days earlier to return a pair of heels I'd left in his car after a fitting. He'd asked to use the bathroom. I'd said, sure. I didn't think twice. Now I couldn't think about anything else. I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling. Me. Did you take the locket from my mom's box? No greeting, no punctuation. His reply came 10 minutes later. Elliot. What are you talking about? I stared. Typed again. Me. You know exactly what I'm talking about. It's gone. You were the last person here. Another pause. Longer this time. Then Elliot. I borrowed it. I just wanted to feel close to you. I was going to give it back. Borrowed, I called him. He answered on the second ring. Clara, listen. You took my mother's locket, I said, voice flat. You opened a box that wasn't yours. You reached inside and you took it. I didn't steal it, he said quickly. I meant to return it. I don't know. After the rehearsal dinner, I panicked. I thought maybe if I had a part of her, I could understand you better. I laughed. A dry, hollow thing. You mocked her. You let them mock her. And now you think wearing a locket fixes that. He went quiet. Then it's at my parents' house. I didn't want to lose it, so I left it there. That was it. That was the final break. You stole something sacred, I whispered, and left it in the house of the people who laughed at her name. Clara, please don't do this. But I already had. I drove to the Hargrave estate without brushing my hair or fixing my face. I didn't need polish. I needed closure. Constance opened the door. Her smile faltered. Clara, where is it? Her eyes darted. What, the locket? I said. Elliot took it. He said he left it here. I want it back. From deeper inside, Edmund's voice rang out. Just give it to her. Moments later, Elliot appeared at the top of the stairs. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes red. He looked like a man who thought he deserved sympathy. He descended slowly, holding the locket between his fingers like a child holding a crumpled note. Here, I snatched it from his hand, opened it, checked inside. My grandmother's photo, the empty slot on the other side untouched, still mine, still waiting. I stared at it for a long moment, then looked up. You didn't just cross a boundary, I said. You trampled over it. You used my grief like it was something you could borrow. I didn't know what else to do. You could have said sorry, I snapped. You could have left it alone. You could have respected something for once. He looked stunned. I still love you, I shook my head. No, Elliot. You loved the version of me that looked good in your world. The curated one, the composed one, but the real me, the grieving me. The woman who still cries when she smells old perfume or hears Nat King Cole in a grocery store. You never made space for her. Behind him, Constance and Edmund stood silent. No apology, no shame. Just tight smiles and expensive cologne. I turned to go. This time I didn't slam the door. I closed it gently, deliberately, like a final chapter shutting. When I got back to my car, I held the locket in my hand. It was warm, heavy, but it no longer felt like loss. It felt like truth. It felt like mine. The days after I walked away from Elliot passed like fog, soft around the edges, but still heavy. I turned my phone off for 3 days. I didn't answer texts. I didn't open emails. I didn't want condolences or curiosity or even concern. I wanted quiet. Elliot tried once more, a missed call. Then another, then nothing. He knew. The wedding planner sent a curt message asking how I wanted to handle the cancellations. I replied with one sentence, please call off everything. That was all I could give. The venue offered a partial refund. Out of pity, I think not policy. The florist left me a voicemail that said she was so sorry, honey, and told me the flowers had already been prepped. I let them go. The dress was boxed and returned. The monogrammed favors discarded. The website was taken down. The countdown app deleted. People whispered. Mutual friends texted. What happened? Are you okay? You don't owe me details, but just know I'm here. But I didn't want to talk about Elliot. Not anymore. Instead, I walked. Every morning, I laced up my sneakers and took the same path my mother used to walk on Sundays. Past the bakery with the cracked window. Around the corner where the yellow house stood, the one she always said looked like a butter cookie. Down to the small park bench near the willow tree where she used to sit with her thermos of coffee and just breathe. Some days I brought the locket with me, some days I didn't, but I always carried her. One morning the sky was pale gold. The air smelled like wet pavement and something sweet like the city was exhaling. I sat on the bench, let the light settle on my shoulders, and opened the locket. One side held my grandmother's portrait, graceful, still. The other side, the one my mother left blank, saying I could fill it when I knew remained empty. And for the first time, that didn't feel like something missing. It felt like possibility. I thought about that moment at the rehearsal dinner. The moment when Edmund turned my mother into a punchline. When Elliot laughed. I used to wish I'd screamed, thrown something, stormed out with fury. But now I understand there is power in stillness. In choosing presence over spectacle. That night, I didn't just walk away from a wedding. I walked toward myself. I didn't just protect my mother's name. I honored the woman she raised me to be. I had always feared being too much, too emotional, too serious, too sentimental. But the truth is I was never too much. I was just too real for people who were comfortable with pretending. Elliot didn't want a partner. He wanted someone polite, someone elegant, someone who would pose for pictures and nod at his parents' passive insults with a pleasant smile. But I'm not built for shallow love. And my mother didn't raise me to shrink. She raised a woman who knew when to speak, when to stand, when to say no. Looking back now, I don't regret saying yes to Elliot. Because saying yes led me to that moment in the orchid room. That moment where I stood up not for drama, but for dignity. I've learned something since then, maybe the most important lesson of all. Saying no to the wrong life is the most powerful yes we can give ourselves. That no saved me. It saved the version of me that almost traded her voice for approval, who almost married into silence, who almost let her mother be erased from her wedding, her story, her memory. Now I wake up in an apartment filled with light. I drink tea from my mother's chipped white mug, the one with the faint crack along the handle. I never repaired it. She used to trace that line with her finger and say, Let it show. That's how people know it survived. I kept the locket on my dresser. I still haven't filled the empty chamber. Maybe one day I will, maybe I won't. What matters is this. It's mine, my choice, my story. And it's no longer about loss. It's about presence. About knowing that love is not just romance or gestures or grand proposals. It's in how someone holds your story, how they speak your name when you're not in the room, how they carry your pain with reverence, not inconvenience. My mother once told me, "You'll know when it's love because it won't ask you to hide." I'm still learning what that looks like, but I know what it's not. It's not silence. It's not a laugh at the wrong moment. It's not stealing something sacred and calling it sentimental. And it's not a wedding dress that fits someone else's expectations more than your own truth. So if you're listening to this and you've ever felt like you had to perform to be loved, like you had to dim yourself to fit, please know you are not alone. You don't have to marry into silence. You don't have to make peace with disrespect. You don't have to be chosen by people who never tried to understand you. You can walk away. You can close the door gently and still walk into the brightest part of your life. My name is Clara Jensen, and I didn't lose a wedding. I reclaimed a voice, and I finally became the woman my mother always saw in me. What I lost that night was real. 6 years of memories, a future I'd imagined, a family I tried to make room for even when they left no room for me. But what I gained that was sacred. I gained the strength to say this far and no further. I gained the clarity to see that grief doesn't make you weak, it makes you honest. And I gained a voice I almost traded away for the illusion of love. My mother always told me don't confuse being chosen with being seen. She knew the difference. Now I do too. I didn't walk away because I was dramatic. I walked away because I remembered who raised me. I remembered the woman who wore cheap perfume and sang in laundromats and still carried more grace than a room full of designer gowns and monogrammed invitations ever could. She mattered, and by protecting her memory, I finally honored myself. So here's my question for you. Have you ever walked away from something that looked perfect on the outside, just to protect your peace on the inside? Have you ever had to choose between honoring someone you love and being accepted by people who never tried to understand you? If you have, tell me your story. I want to hear it. And if you're still learning how to stand up for yourself the way they would have stood up for you. You're already braver than you think. Leave a comment below. If you've ever chosen self-respect over comfort, vote number 7. If you're still finding your voice, vote number 3. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to EN Reddit Story. Every story here is a reminder. You're not too much. You're not too emotional. You're not alone. The locket is back in its box. And this time, so is peace.